This video will provide an introductory overview of fetal circulation and the changes that occur during birth. It is assumed that the viewers of this video have a prior understanding of normal adult circulation. Like in adult circulation, blood enters the fetal heart through the inferior and superior vena cava into the right atrium. Unlike in adult circulation, however, there is a connection between the right and left atriums called the patent foramen ovale. Because of this connection, blood in the right atrium can go one of two places. Most of it flows through the foramen ovale directly into the left atrium and then into the left ventricle, aorta, and systemic circulation, thus bypassing the lungs. The rest of the blood from the right atrium enters the right ventricle and is pumped into the pulmonary artery. There it encounters another characteristic unique to the fetal heart. There is a connection between the pulmonary artery and the aorta called the ductus arteriosus. Most of the blood that has entered the pulmonary artery is shunted via the ductus arteriosus to the aorta, thus also bypassing the lungs. Why is all this blood avoiding the lungs? Fetal alveoli are full of fluid, not air. The lungs are not used for breathing, and it's not where gas exchange occurs. Hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction, the constriction of arterioles in low oxygen environments, increases pressure and resistance in pulmonary arterioles. This directs the majority of blood exiting the heart away from the lungs and into systemic circulation instead. Deoxygenated blood travels from systemic circulation to the placenta via two umbilical arteries. These umbilical arteries stem from the internal iliac arteries and travel along the umbilical cord. In the placenta, fetal and maternal blood don't actually mix, but come into close enough contact to exchange gases, nutrients, and waste products by diffusion. This transport process is complex and highly selective. As far as gases go, maternal red blood cells transfer their oxygen to fetal red blood cells, and fetal red blood cells give their CO2 to maternal red blood cells. This happens because fetal red blood cells not only have more hemoglobin, but their hemoglobin has a higher affinity for oxygen than maternal hemoglobin. The oxygen saturation curve for fetal hemoglobin, drawn here in red, is shifted left compared to the curve for maternal hemoglobin, drawn here in blue. This is due to different genes that are activated in the fetus. Interestingly, fetal hemoglobin genes can sometimes be reactivated pharmacologically in adults to treat diseases such as sickle cell anemia. Additionally, the partial pressure of oxygen is considerably higher in maternal blood, and the partial pressure of CO2 is higher in fetal blood, allowing gases to diffuse readily in the correct direction. Oxygenated blood returning from the placenta is pumped back to the heart via the umbilical vein. About 2/3 of it goes through the liver, passing through hepatic capillaries before entering the inferior vena cava. The remaining portion of this oxygenated blood gets shunted through the ductus venosus, a shortcut that allows blood to bypass the liver and go straight to the vena cava. Here, oxygenated blood from the liver and from the ductus venosus meet up with the portion of deoxygenated blood from systemic circulation that did not go to the placenta. This mixture of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood travel together through the inferior vena cava to the heart. Simultaneously, deoxygenated blood from the head and arm regions enters the heart via the superior vena cava. Inferior and superior vena cava blood mixes in the right atrium and the cycle begins again. Since oxygenated blood is mixed with deoxygenated blood as it enters the right atrium, blood entering systemic circulation in the fetus is never as oxygenated as adult blood would be at this point. The partial pressure of oxygen in fetal blood is 20 to 30 millimeters of mercury compared to 100 millimeters of mercury in adult blood. Here is an overview of the adaptations present in fetal circulation. We have the patent foramen ovale, which is a connection between the right and left atriums of the heart. There is also the ductus arteriosus, the connection between the pulmonary artery of the aorta. Both the patent foramen ovale and the ductus arteriosus allow blood to bypass the lungs. We also have the ductus venosus, the connection between the umbilical vein and the inferior vena cava, which allows blood to bypass the liver. And of course, there is the umbilical cord and the placenta. Now, what happens when the baby is born? During a vaginal birth, the passage through the birth canal causes roughly 1/3 of the fetal lung fluid to be squeezed out of the baby's lungs. Factors from the external environment such as sound, temperature, and touch then stimulate the nervous system to initiate the baby's first breath. The first breath expands the alveoli and forces even more fluid out, replacing it with air. The first few breaths of a baby's life requires high pressure to overcome the surface tension covering the alveoli and force out all of the fluid. The effort required to breathe reduces as fluid leaves the lungs and alveoli expand. Now that oxygen is in the lungs, central chemoreceptors are stimulated, causing arterioles to vasodilate and decrease resistance. This makes blood from the right heart rush into the pulmonary capillaries to be oxygenated. This oxygenated blood returning from the lungs is then pumped into the left atrium, increasing the pressure in the left atrium. Simultaneously, pressure in the right atrium is decreasing as blood can now flow out of it towards the lungs, and this reversal of pressure pushes the septum praemun against the relatively rigid atrial septum, closing the foramen ovale. This closure is initially a functional change, and full closure is completed later as endothelial and fibrous tissues proliferate. A remnant of the foramen ovale can be observed in the adult heart as the fossa ovalis, a shallow depression in the right side of the interatrial septum. With the closing of the foramen ovale, all the blood entering the right heart flows into the right ventricle and is pumped into the pulmonary circulation as it is in normal adult circulation. When the placenta is delivered from the mother, the decrease in temperature triggers a contraction of Wharton's jelly, a fatty substance in the umbilical cord containing white blood cells and stem cells. This creates a natural clamp, decreasing blood flow to the umbilical cord. Further vasoconstriction occurs, and soon blood flow through the umbilical cord ceases and the cord is cut. The umbilical arteries form the structural basis of what will eventually become the medial umbilical ligament and the superior vesicular artery, while the umbilical vein forms the basis of the ligamentum teres hepatis. The sphincter around the ductus venosus constricts. Functional closure occurs within minutes, forcing all blood entering the liver to pass through the hepatic sinusoids. Full structural closure of the ductus venosus occurs within 3 to 7 days. The remnants of this structure become the ligamentum venosum. The cutting of the umbilical cord increases total peripheral resistance in systemic circulation, which increases pressure in the aorta. As oxygenated blood from the lungs is pumped through the body, the partial pressure of oxygen increases in the aorta, triggering the smooth muscle cells around the ductus arteriosus to contract and create a functional seal, which is completed after a few weeks to a few months of life. The remnants of the ductus arteriosus become the ligamentum arteriosum. And oops, we forgot to add the fossa ovalis to the list. The closure of these shunts complete the transition from fetal to newborn circulation.